22 years. Sometimes saying it aloud still felt strange. More than half my life spent walking the same concrete floors, breathing the same air thick with the smell of machine oil and hot metal, listening to the symphony of Omnicorp manufacturing. It wasn't just a job. It was mine, my domain. The factory floor wasn't just a place I worked. It was a place I understood, down to the last rattling conveyor belt and flickering fluorescent light. My official title was floor supervisor, but anyone who actually worked the machines knew it was more than that. I knew Big Bertha, the main press, needed a specific 3-second pause after the initial pressure application, or she'd shear the bolts clean off. I knew the quirks of the number 4 milling machine. How a slight change in the ambient humidity meant you had to adjust the coolant flow by a fraction, or you'd get chatter marks invisible to the naked eye, but catastrophic for the tolerances our aerospace client demanded. I knew the sound the main hydraulics made just before a seal was about to weep, a low groan, almost lost in the din, but clear as a bell to me. It wasn't in any manual. It was learned knowledge, earned over 2 decades of vigilance. My proudest boast? 22 years, and not a single major lost-time accident on my shifts. Not one. Luck? Maybe a sliver. Mostly, it was meticulousness. It was knowing the limits, knowing the signs, drilling procedures until they were muscle memory for the crew. It was checking the safety interlocks myself every single week, even though the official log only required monthly checks. It was trusting my gut when a machine sounded wrong, even if the gauges read green. That kind of record isn't built on luck. It's built on sweat, attention, and giving a damn. And the supply chain software? Gods, that monstrosity. A patchwork system bolted together over years, interfacing with dozens of suppliers, tracking thousands of parts. One wrong entry, one missed flag, and you'd have a truckload of useless titanium rods sitting on the dock while the line starved for the correct grade of steel, costing thousands in downtime. I wasn't a coder, but I knew that system's arteries and blockages better than the IT department half the time. I'd built custom alerts, workarounds, little checks and balances that kept the materials flowing just right, preventing those bottlenecks that could cripple production for a day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. The lifeblood of the plant. The crew knew it. We had our rhythm. Guys like Frank on the lathe, Maria running QC, old Sam who knew more about the electrical grid than anyone still breathing. We understood each other. There was respect. I covered for them when family emergencies came up. They watched my back, made sure the preventative maintenance logs I insisted on were actually done right, not just pencil whipped. We were a team, keeping this behemoth running. Then there was Davis, Manager Davis, sharp suits, sharper focus on spreadsheets and bottom lines. He'd arrived maybe 3 years ago, full of MBA jargon and talk of optimization. He saw the factory floor not as a complex organism, but as a cost center. He'd nod during walkthroughs, eyes scanning reports on his tablet, never really seeing the intricate dance of machinery and skill. We'd clashed a few times, quietly. I'd flag a need for preemptive overhaul on a critical motor. He'd see the upfront cost and push it off, asking for more data. He just didn't get it. Didn't want to. I should have seen it coming, I suppose. The whispers about restructuring, the sudden emphasis on future-proofing our workforce. But 22 years, you build a sense of permanence. A misplaced sense of loyalty, maybe. You think your record, your dedication, it means something tangible. The call came on a Tuesday. "John, can you pop up to my office? Bring Sarah from HR with you." That tight feeling in my chest started then. Sarah was nice enough, but she wasn't usually involved in routine operational meetings. Davis's office was sterile, modern, minimalist desk, framed abstract art that probably cost more than my car. He gestured for me to sit. Sarah already perched on the edge of another chair, holding a thin folder. Davis leaned back, steepling his fingers. That corporate pose. "John," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "We've been evaluating the operational structure moving forward, looking at synergies, efficiencies, the usual." He smiled faintly. It didn't reach his eyes. "As part of that," Sarah picked up, opening the folder, "we're making some changes to the floor supervision model." My gut clenched. Here it comes. Davis took over again. "We appreciate your long service, John. 22 years is a commendable run." Commendable, like a marathon I'd finished, not a career I'd poured my life in. "But," he continued, the word hanging in the air, "we feel it's time for, well, new blood, fresh perspectives." He paused, letting it sink in. The insult, thinly veiled, old blood, apparently, stale perspective. My 22 years of keeping his precious factory running without disaster suddenly counted for nothing against a catchphrase. "We've identified a candidate," Davis went on, glancing at Sarah. "Chad, young fellow, degree in operations management, seems very forward-thinking. We feel his qualifications are better suited for the future direction of Omnicorp. Chad? I knew Chad, barely. Some manager's nephew from another department always seemed more interested in his phone than the safety briefing. Forward-thinking? Qualifications. He barely knew which end of a wrench to hold, but he was young, and I suddenly realized with sickening certainty he'd be cheap. So, Davis said, leaning forward slightly, your position as it currently exists is being eliminated. The air went out of the room. Eliminated. Just like that. 22 years of expertise, loyalty, sweat, eliminated. Like a line item on one of his spreadsheets. We can offer the standard severance package, Sarah said softly, pushing a document across the desk. And we'll need you to train Chad up over the next 2 weeks. Ensure a smooth transition. Train my replacement. The cheap, unqualified nephew hired because I was too old. Too not future-facing. The rage, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my vision. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples. My hands curled into fists under the table. Decades ago, that temper might have flared. Words, maybe worse, might have erupted. But 22 years teaches you control, if nothing else, especially when you're being kicked out the door. I took a slow breath, uncurled my fists, looked Davis straight in the eye. I understand, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, cold, even. The severance offer was insulting. Bare minimum by law. They mentioned Chad's starting salary later. Less than half of mine, of course. That was the real future direction. Cut costs, replace experience with cheap youth, dress it up in corporate bullshit. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. A switch had flipped inside me. The hurt was still there, a raw, burning thing beneath my ribs. But layered over it now was something else. A cold, clear resolve. They wanted a cheap supervisor? They'd get one? They wanted a smooth transition? I'd give them exactly what they paid for. Not sabotage. No, that wasn't my way. But malicious compliance? Selective information transfer? Oh yes. I would train Chad. I would train him precisely according to the value they placed on the role. Superficial, incomplete, dangerously ignorant. All right, Chad, I said on day 1 of the training, forcing a professional tone. Let's start with the Kestrel 5000 packaging robot. It's the newest piece of kit on the floor. We spent half the morning on it. Chad loved it. All touchscreens and automated sequences. He took notes, asked questions that showed he understood the interface, the software side. He looked good doing it. Davis even walked by during this part, saw Chad nodding along confidently, gave me a thumbs up. Perfect. The Kestrel was flashy, sure. It also wrapped finished pallets. If it broke down, someone could do it by hand with minimal delay. It was about as critical to the core function of the plant as the coffee machine in the break room. Then we moved to the older sections. Old Betsy, the main press, groaned as she cycled. Chad winced. Sounds rough, he commented. She's got character, I replied evenly. Just follow the startup sequence in the manual. Page 47, Section B. I didn't mention the unofficial sequence I used, the one that eased the pressure buildup, the one that kept her seals intact. I didn't mention the specific hydraulic fluid top-off schedule, far more frequent than the manual suggested, that kept her from overheating on long runs. The manual, that became my mantra. Stick to the manual. The outdated, inefficient, often dangerously simplified official manual. Preventative maintenance? That was the cornerstone of my safety record. The hidden checks, the subtle listening, the proactive part replacements. So, daily checks? Chad asked, looking bored already. What's the minimum? I pointed to the big, obvious pressure gauges on a row of hydraulic pumps. Just keep an eye on these main readings, Chad, I said. The manual covers the acceptable range. If they stay within that, you're generally good. I deliberately didn't point out the almost invisible vibration sensor low down on Pump 3's housing, the one that gave you a 2-day warning before its main bearing seized. I didn't mention the specific way you had to clean the coolant filters on the milling machines, not just rinse them like the manual said, but use a specific solvent sequence to prevent microscopic residue buildup that eventually caused overheating and tool damage. Just give these points a quick look each morning. I waved vaguely at a complex manifold. They rarely cause issues if you just follow the basic restart procedure if something flags. Outdated time wasters, I framed them as. He readily agreed. He had ideas, of course, fresh perspective. He wanted to streamline the intake process for raw materials via the supply chain software. This triple-check validation for incoming manifests, he said, scrolling through the interface I knew so intimately. It seems redundant. If the supplier sends the ASN, why do we need our guys to manually verify container codes and batch numbers before unloading? Wastes time. I looked at him. He was serious. He didn't understand the number of times a tired supplier forklift driver had loaded the wrong drum, or a label had been smudged, or the ASN data had been corrupted. That triple check had saved us from disaster, from loading flammable solvent into a vat meant for inert lubricant, from using substandard alloy in a critical component. More times than I could count. My old self would have explained, patiently, forcefully. My new self saw an opportunity. "That's a bold idea, Chad," I said, keeping my voice neutral, maybe even a little impressed. Cutting out steps like that shows real initiative. Definitely aligns with the new, efficient direction Davis wants. You should definitely bring that up, maybe even implement it. Show them you're making changes. His chest puffed out slightly. "Yeah, you think?" "Absolutely," I confirmed, looking him square in the eye. "Streamline things." Inside, I felt a cold knot tighten. I could already picture the chaos. A misidentified chemical drum. A production line halted for days, tracing a contaminated batch. All because of streamlining. His arrogance grew daily. He started calling me chief or old-timer, sometimes condescendingly, sometimes trying to be buddy-buddy. He'd interrupt my explanations of complex processes with, yeah, I get the gist. He clearly thought this job was about bossing people around and looking good for Davis, not about the deep, grinding, constant vigilance it actually required. The crew saw it. Frank gave me a look across the workshop floor one afternoon, after Chad had confidently given instructions that directly contradicted standard safety protocol for locking out the number 2 grinder. I just shook my head slightly. Frank understood. Maria in QC started double-checking everything coming off the line during Chad's brief solo practice runs. The unease was palpable among the veterans. They knew competence when they saw it, and they knew Chad. The final day arrived faster than I expected. I cleared out my few personal items from the small supervisor's office, old photos, a chipped mug, a worn copy of a machinery handbook. Davis gave me the perfunctory handshake, eyes already on his next meeting. Sarah from HR offered a sympathetic grimace and my final paycheck. I walked towards the main exit. The sounds of the factory floor, my factory floor, washing over me one last time. Chad was standing near the time clock, trying to look important while scrolling on his phone. I walked past him without a word, without a glance. As I reached the heavy steel door leading out to the parking lot, I paused, took one final look back. The vast space, the intricate dance of machines humming, whirring, pressing, cutting. A place I had known, protected, mastered for 22 years. It felt alien now, yet intimately familiar. A part of me was being left behind, no doubt. But another part felt a dark, cold, burgeoning sense of foreboding satisfaction, like leaving the fuse lit on a very slow-burning charge. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the afternoon sun, head held high. The air outside smelled clean, different. I didn't know what was next for me, not really. But I knew, with absolute certainty, what was next for Omnicorp Manufacturing. It was only a matter of time, and I would wait. The first few weeks after leaving Omnicorp were strange, like losing a limb you didn't realize you leaned on so heavily. The silence of my small apartment was deafening compared to the constant hum and clang I'd lived with for 2 decades. I started fixing things around the house, tinkering in the garage, trying to keep my hands busy. I resisted the urge to call Frank or Maria to ask how things were going. Better not to know. Better to let the seeds I hadn't sown, but had certainly failed to weed out, sprout on their own. It didn't take long. About 3 weeks in, Frank called me, sounding hesitant. "John, hey, just checking in. How's retirement treating you?" We both knew I wasn't retirement age. "Taking it easy, Frank. What's up?" Probably nothing," he said, a little too quickly. "Just, Betsy's making some funny noises, like a clicking sound on the downstroke sometimes. Chad had maintenance look, they tightened a few bolts, said it was probably just settling after the last routine service." Routine service. I hadn't scheduled any major service for Betsy before I left. And tightening random bolts? Amateur hour. That clicking wasn't settling. It was likely the precursor to the main bearing complaining. I just grunted non-committally down the phone. "Hope they figure it out," I said, keeping my voice flat. A week later, Maria called. "John, you won't believe this. We got flagged on the weekly energy consumption report, spiked nearly 15% across the board. Davis is asking Chad what's going on, and Chad's blaming it on a software calibration anomaly in the reporting system." I almost laughed. Software anomaly? Number. It was the machines working harder, less efficiently, because the delicate balance of maintenance and operational tweaks only I truly knew was gone. Chad was likely running them harder, pushing cycles faster to try and meet quotas he didn't understand how to manage smoothly, ignoring the subtle signs of strain. The increased energy use was the factory screaming inefficiency, but Chad wouldn't see that. He'd see numbers on a screen and blame the screen. Sounds like he's got it under control then, I offered blandly. Then came the chemical mix issue. Frank called again, voice lower this time. Remember that solvent batch for the Delta contract? QC downstream just put a hold on half the pallets, said the viscosity was off-spec. Chad's arguing with them, says our internal tests were fine. Internal tests. Chad wouldn't know how to run the nuanced specific gravity tests required for that solvent, the ones sensitive to the slight calibration drifts on the mixing valves I use to adjust weekly. He probably just checked the basic pH level, signed it off, and pushed it through. Another small fire started, one Chad was busy blaming on someone else. These were just the first tremors, small things, easily dismissed by someone like Chad, easily hidden from someone like Davis who only looked at the top-line numbers, but I knew they were symptoms. The disease, incompetence, arrogance, disrespect for experience, was spreading. Months 2 through 5. That's when the tremors became earthquakes. Small ones at first, then bigger. Around the 8-week mark, Betsy had her first real tantrum. Not the clicking, but a full-on partial breakdown. Frank described it vividly. A juddering halt, mid-cycle. A screech of tortured metal, followed by an ominous silence on that section of the line. It wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. But it took down production of a key component for 3 days while Chad and the increasingly stressed maintenance crew scrambled. They eventually got it running again, Frank said. After bypassing a secondary pressure regulator Chad insisted was faulty. It wasn't. It was compensating for wear in the main cylinder, something I knew how to balance. And essentially, patch welding a support bracket that looked worryingly flimsy. Chad declared victory. I knew he'd just put a ticking time bomb under more stress. Then came the rejected shipment. Maria was practically spitting fire when she called me about that one, catching me just as I was heading out for a walk. John, you remember the Harrison Corp order? The big one? With the mirror finish requirement? Of course. $1 million contract. Well, they just rejected the entire goddamn shipment. Said the finish consistency was unacceptable, micro-pitting visible under magnification. Chad signed off on the QC reports himself. I could picture it perfectly. The final polishing line required incredibly precise control of abrasive paste flow and buffer speed, adjusted constantly based on temperature and humidity readings from sensors Chad probably didn't even know existed. Without those micro-adjustments, you'd get exactly what Harrison Corp found. Inconsistent finish, microscopic flaws. Chad, relying on the basic visual check described in the outdated manual, wouldn't have seen it, but the client's far more rigorous incoming inspection caught it immediately. Davis went ballistic, Maria continued, called Chad into his office, shouting loud enough for half the floor to hear, costs for rework, penalty clauses. Harrison is threatening to pull the whole contract. The pressure was mounting. Chad was starting to look less like a wunderkind and more like a deer in headlights. He apparently started blaming the polishing machinery itself, saying it needed replacement, trying to deflect from his own operational failures. The ruined chemical batch was next, maybe month 4. That one made the rounds because of the smell and the guys in hazmat suits. Remember Chad's streamlining idea for the supply chain software? Bypassing the triple checks? Well, it finally happened. A supplier sent a drum of industrial cleaning solvent mislabeled as the inert lubricant needed for the high-speed cutters. Because Chad had disabled the manual verification steps, the receiving crew just scanned the faulty label and sent it straight to the line's reservoir. Luckily, someone noticed the acrid smell before it was pumped into the main system, averting a potential fire or explosion. But the entire contents of that reservoir, hundreds of gallons of expensive, specialized lubricant, were now contaminated. It had to be drained, triple flushed, and disposed of as hazardous waste. The cost was enormous, not just for the lost lubricant and disposal fees, but the line was down for 2 solid days for the cleanup. Chad tried to blame the supplier, then the receiving crew. Davis, I heard, was practically vibrating with rage. The new blood wasn't looking so fresh anymore. Chad started to panic visibly, working longer hours, snapping at the crew, chain-drinking coffee. He tried implementing some of the modern management techniques he'd boasted about. Complex Six Sigma charts he didn't understand, team huddle buzzword sessions that wasted time. He even apparently tried to subtly blame me in meetings, suggesting the legacy systems were inherently unstable, that I'd left things on the verge of collapse. The veteran crew wasn't buying it, and neither, I suspected, was Davis, who now just saw his cheap solution costing him a fortune. And then, month 6 hit, almost exactly half a year after I walked out that door. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon shift. It was Betsy. Of course, it was Betsy. Frank called me that evening. His voice was shaky. John, it's bad, real bad. What happened, Frank? Betsy, she just went. Middle of a heavy press cycle. Sounded like a bomb went off. Screeching metal. Then bang, a huge crash. Main drive seized solid. Looks like the whole internal gearbox just shredded itself. Through sparks, small fire started in the hydraulic fluid that spilled out. Everyone's okay, thank God. Tommy was nearby, but the emergency stop worked on the conveyor feed just before a piece flew off. But the machine, John, it's totaled. Completely mangled. Silence hung on the line. Old Betsy, the heart of that production line, gone. Not just broken, but catastrophically destroyed. The patch job Chad had done months earlier had clearly failed under stress, causing a cascading internal failure. The lack of proper lubrication, the ignored warnings, the pushing past her limits. It had all culminated in this. Whole lines down, Frank continued, his voice hollow. Indefinitely. They're talking months, maybe longer, to even source a replacement if they can find one. Costs are gonna be astronomical. I felt nothing. No, that's not true. I felt a profound, cold, final stillness. The inevitable had arrived. The price of stupidity had come due. Thanks for letting me know, Frank, I said quietly. Keep safe. The next day, my phone rang. Caller ID, Omnicorp mainline. I almost didn't answer. Curiosity, maybe a sliver of vengeful anticipation, made me pick up. John? It's Sarah from HR. Her voice was strained, tense. Sarah. John, we need you to come in. There's been an incident, a major equipment failure. I heard, I said noncommittally. Yes, well, Mr. Davis and Chad, they believe, given the timing and the nature of the failure, they're suggesting the possibility of sabotage. Before you left, there it was, the desperation, the final pathetic attempt to shift the blame. I almost laughed again. Sabotage? After 6 months? With their own documented incompetence leading up to it? That's a serious accusation, Sarah, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Yes, well, they insisted. We've had to launch an internal investigation. They specifically mentioned you. We need your statement. Sarah, I said, letting a chill creep into my tone. I handed over all operational responsibilities 6 months ago. I trained my replacement as requested. My record speaks for itself. If machinery failed 6 months after my departure under someone else's supervision, perhaps the investigation should focus there. There was a pause. They found some anomalies in the maintenance logs just before you left. Likely the standard end-of-service notes I always made, probably misinterpreted by Chad as something sinister. I assure you, I said firmly, any logs I signed off on were accurate at the time. Check my entire 22-year history. We understand, John, but... No buts, Sarah, I cut her off, sharper now. If you want my statement, have your lawyers contact me. Otherwise, I have nothing further to say about Omnicorp's internal problem. I hung up. The investigation, as it turned out, was swift and brutal for them. Apparently, upper management, smelling a massive insurance claim and potential lawsuit, brought in external engineering consultants alongside the team. They pulled everything. OP's stellar 22-year maintenance and safety record, the logs showing Chad consistently overriding standard procedures, witness statements from the crew detailing Chad's and his dismissal of warnings, the botched repair job on Betsy months earlier, my training documentation, which showed I'd covered the basics but couldn't possibly impart 22 years of nuanced experience in 2 weeks, especially to someone unreceptive. The final nail in their coffin was the data recorder on Betsy. It showed fluctuating hydraulic pressures and temperature, classic signs of starting weeks and escalate dramatic repair. The investigation reportedly concluded catastrophic due to gross operational deferred critical maintenance supervision, exacerbated by management, failing to address this, and underskilling was laughed out of the, making Davis and Chad look not only malicious. The fallout was immediate. I heard it from Frank 2 days later. Chad was fired on the spot, security escorting him out while he was still protesting. Davis was summoned to corporate headquarters the next day and returned only to clear out his desk. Fired. Even Sarah from HR was apparently given a severe reprimand for her role in the hiring and dismissal process. Omnicorp's stock took a hit when the production halt was announced. Rumors flew about the Harrison Corp contract being officially terminated. Then, about a week after the firings, my phone rang again. Unknown number, but local area code. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief, clipped, expensive sounding. Mr. OP's last name, this is Arthur Sterling, CEO of Omnicorp. Please give me a call back at your earliest convenience. It's regarding an urgent operational matter. The CEO himself. Urgent operational matter. I almost deleted it. But the sheer audacity, the sheer gall, I waited a day, let him sweat. Then, I poured myself a small whiskey, something I rarely did, sat down in my comfortable chair and dialed the number. His secretary put me straight through. John, thank you for calling back. Sterling's voice was smoother than Davis's, but held an edge of desperation. Listen, we're in a bit of a bind here, as you may have heard. I read something about it, I said dryly. Yes, look, frankly, we screwed up. Letting you go was a mistake, a monumental one. Davis and that replacement, they ran the floor into the ground, complete disaster. He sighed heavily. We need you back, John. Name your price. Triple your old salary, quadruple, signing bonus, full benefits restored, premium package, whatever it takes. We need your expertise to get production back online, to rebuild. I let the silence stretch, savored it, heard the faint sound of his breathing on the other end, waiting. 22 years of loyalty repaid with dismissal for being old blood. 2 weeks training my own incompetent replacement. 6 months waiting for the inevitable crash caused by their arrogance and stupidity. And now, this, crawling back. Mr. Sterling, I began, my voice perfectly calm, measured. I appreciate the offer. It's generous. Another pause. But I've discovered I quite enjoy not having to worry about other people's monumental mistakes. John, please. However, I cut him off smoothly, I am considering some independent consulting work. My rate, I plucked a number out of thin air, something utterly, ludicrously exorbitant, is $5,000 per hour, 4-hour minimum retainer, paid up front, per day, plus expenses, of course. My old-school expertise, you see, comes at a premium now. The silence on the other end was profound. I could practically hear him doing the math, choking on the figure. It was more than my previous annual salary for a single week's work. 5,000, he finally stammered. Per hour? That's the rate, I confirmed pleasantly. Let me know if Omnicorp wishes to retain my services. Before he could respond, I added, Thank you for the call, Mr. Sterling, and gently hung up the phone. I took a slow sip of my whiskey. The silence in my apartment didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful, vindicating. They'd learned the hard way. Experience isn't just a line item you can streamline. Sometimes it's the only thing holding the whole damn factory together. And they'd thrown it away. Now they could pay the price. Every last, satisfying cent they deserved. That's all for this story. I'll be back with another one. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It motivates me to create more content like this.